This is the Kolloquium Provenienzforschung, and we have Laurel Zuckerman today here. Both of us were already at a workshop today, so we've been doing this topic for pretty much a day now, and we've had lots of discussions already, so we are basically coming in from lots of discussions. You are not, but we hope that in the end, in the big talk, we can bring both of this together. Laurel Zuckerman is from Open Art Data. Her work currently focuses on the art world and the Holocaust, and she explores how knowledge graphs, NLP, IA, and the digital tools and techniques of investigative data journalism can help research art routines network. She's a former IT project manager and claimed in an art restitution phase, and as I mentioned, the editor of Open Art Data. And we're very glad that Laurel is here today. Her presentation is called Shared Knowledge Graphs as a Tool in Recovering Looted Cultural Heritage and the History of Marginalized People. And with that, I will hand over to you and we make a quick switch.
Thank you, Sarah. It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank Sarah of the Lost Art Foundation and Jan of the TU Berlin University and Lucy of the Wikimedia Foundation for making this possible. There we go. So what I hope to accomplish this evening is to help you learn how Wikidata knowledge graphs can help to detect problematic ownership histories, how we can use it to investigate looting and laundering networks, and how one can connect to other knowledge sources, and how we can also use it to recover the history of marginalized people whose stories have been erased or misrepresented by what we think of as authorities. So I was not always a researcher. I started out as simply a family member. What you see on the left, yeah, it's your left, is the dining room in Cologne of my great-granduncle, Paul Lefty, and the Picasso called The Actor that used to hang there. It's from a magazine published in 1921. And what you see on the right is the same painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it was my experience as a claimant that led me to research. After 12 years of researching with a team of researchers, this painting, we finally filed on behalf of the heirs a claim against the Metropolitan Museum of Art to recover the painting. But the thing that stuck out in my mind and led me to this path was that from 1938, when Paul Lefty sold The Actor, every story told about the painting was false. And what you see on this slide in the top bubble is a story that was told that was not true. And what you see in the middle, in the round circles, was the year when the story was told. And what you see in the bottom, in yellow, is the name of the person who told the stories. And the art historians among us will immediately recognize nearly all of these names. These are considered very prestigious authorities. So I wondered, was this unique to our case, or did other families encounter the same problems of false stories told about artwork from their collections? What you see on this slide is just the tiniest portion of artworks which had had either completely false stories told about them, or from which at some point the Jewish owner was erased from the published provenance. So why erase persecuted Jewish owners from provenance?
I honestly don't know. I'm sorry why this thing is there. I can't close it. It doesn't react.
The Nazis were defeated 80 years ago. Why are we still encountering the problem of false provenances today?
If anybody has an idea,
you may have to wait for the I think that one of the best explanations came from the chief of the Antiquities Trafficking Union, which usually deals with looted antiquities. But in 2024, you probably saw it in the press, he seized a number of Sheila artworks that had belonged to the Holocaust victim, Fritz Grunbaum, saying that they were looted art, they had transited through New York, therefore he had jurisdiction in this affair. And the way that he explained it in a document, a legal document that was filed, is as follows. I'll read it in just a second. But what's interesting to note is that all of the paintings that he seized, but one, were returned to the families. The one stayed in the Art Institute of Chicago that fought, and it's because it is still fighting. And because of this, we have this tremendous legal file. This is from a very, very long legal document, which I'll read if I can move the text.
Yeah. Okay, well, wait, because it doesn't seem to react. I think it's frozen.
Okay, well, what he said, I'll just read the last part of it because that's the part that the top part says that for an artwork to have value, it has to be saleable. It has to be something that can be public and something that can be saleable. And for this, it has to have the veneer of being lawfully obtained. And so he says, the goal of most art trafficking conspiracies, therefore, is not simply to obtain a work of art. A necessary concomitant must also be to ensure that the stolen artwork's true owner remains forever concealed. And that takes deliberate action. And so why is this so relevant? It's because the value, the market value of the artwork is directly linked to falsifying the ownership history. And that, as he made the argument, is what makes it an ongoing international criminal conspiracy. And he literally titled the chapter in the document, The Cornfield-Collier Conspiracy. And I think this is one of the things that makes researching Nazi looted art so extremely difficult and challenging. It's because there's a lot of money involved. So all of you were in the German Lost Art Foundation. All of you present know very well the history of Nazi looting. But it's always important to keep in mind how closely linked the genocide of the Jewish people was to the plundering of the Jewish people. And that these expropriations occurred under a legal veneer very often. The history of the artwork's provenance is very often falsified, even to today, and the Jewish owners are often erased. The story of the ownership history is often told by interested parties. And the data, of course, is in silos. So why knowledge graphs? Well, knowledge graphs are ideal for tracking complex hidden networks over long periods of time. Why in the title did I put shared knowledge graphs? It's because no one source, not even the Wikidata knowledge graph, has all the elements. And so we need to be able to link up the information that is held in it. Why am I talking about Wikidata tonight? Why do I think Wikidata is so important in researching Nazi looted art? It's because it is a gigantic knowledge graph. It's multilingual, and it already has the key properties that we need for Holocaust and looted art research. They're already in Wikidata. It has a very rich library of external identifiers, which enables us to disambiguate, that is to identify precisely who somebody is beyond just the name, and to link that person to wherever the person appears in other databases. And its graph structure enables us to track relationships over time and over space. But one of the most important things is that it's an open wiki community with multiple authorities. And that is essential to marginalize people who have been disappeared or misrepresented by the authorities. So how do we use Wikidata for looted art? This is at its most simple. we look for key information in Wikidata, we identify that information, and we make sure that we can use that information in queries. So the basic information here is artwork owned by someone. And who is that someone? It's very important to know who that someone is. Is it an art leading red flag name? Is it a Holocaust victim? Is it someone whose name keeps popping up in restitution cases? Is it a member of the family? So just pay attention to those who aren't Wikidata fanatics. Just pay attention to the column on the left, the property of Wikidata. You have all these properties that cover all of human knowledge. And so what we do is we identify the ones that interest us for this particular research, like the profession, the art professions, like ownership, like all the information about an artwork, investigated by, key significant events that are related to the Holocaust, to plunder, and to restitution. Events like Aryanization, which take place often before an artwork is plundered or sold under duress. We look for properties like Yad Vashem identifiers, heraldship identifiers, lost art identifiers, and so on. So if, for example, we want to know when we see a name in a provenance, if that person is a red flag name, how do we find it? By a combination of a property and an entity investigated by the OSS Art Movie Investigation Unit. So what's that? That's a list of 1,000 names that appeared in a report that was published in 1946, which was the summary of all of the research done by a very small team of investigators, part of the Monuments Men. And their job was to document Nazi art looting networks, which they did. And so if a person was investigated by the Art Looting Investigation Unit, it is a red flag name. A very simple query in Wikidata. What that means is that we can quickly identify all those people in Wikidata, and beyond that, we can identify the artworks that they own, which are in Wikidata. At its simplest, using the query helper in Wikidata, the query literally looks like this. Investigated by Art Looting Investigation Unit. So what's another identity that is incredibly important in Nazi-looted art? It's who is a persecuted Jewish art collector. If the name of such a person shows up, we want to know it. So when you think of persecuted Jewish art collector, you often think of someone who died in camps. And that's a query that one can do. For example, here we have art collectors or art dealers who perished at Auschwitz or Theresienstadt. That would be a query. But that's not enough. That just captures the tiniest slice of those people. So in addition to subject has role, the way that we would reference it with data, subject has role, Holocaust victim. It could also be someone who has a significant event, Aryanization, or claim for restitution, or persecution by the Nazis. It also could be someone who is described by the source, a very specific source, Jewish collectors and leaders victims of Nazi persecution. Or it could be a person who has a lost art ID, because that person has their family or heirs has launched a search request in the German Lost Art Foundation database. And so to sweep up all of those people and know who they are, we combine all. So already we have the means to know if someone's a red flag name or a persecuted Jewish collector in Wikidata, and the ability to link that to their artworks. So the next question is, what did they own? And where are those artworks today? So we're always going to be asking, when we're going into this knowledge graph, we're always going to be going deeper. We're always going to be asking, what else? So I'm going to do just a couple little demonstrations. One is the starting point, because you can start at any point in the graph. One is the starting point is going to be a restitution case for a specific artwork, and the other is going to be a starting point for a specific victim of the Holocaust. And we'll ask, what else did the person own? Where is it today? Who else handled these same artworks? Why would we ask that? Because we want to know the networks. And who are these people, these other people, in relation to the art? So this is schematically what it looks like when you start with a single case. You go down to see all of the owners of the artworks in that case. And then we're going to go down and see all of the other artworks those people owned, and so on. It's a graph where we continue to go deeper and deeper. So I like this example because this El Greco was returned to the heirs of Julius Priester in 2015. It had a fantastic false provenance. And so we're going to start with this one, and we'll look at the names that appeared in the provenance of this artwork. As you see, you have a Nazi appraiser, you have Rudolf Heinemann, the Peanut Post Gallery, which is a very interesting name, Midler, and so on. But we're going to focus just on two names here because the graph gets very big. Frederick Mott and the gallery he owned the St. Lucas Gallery. And so I'm simplifying in this query because it's more data than this, but so that you can see it. What you see here is St. Lucas Gallery, that's the gallery, and it is owned by Frederick Mott. So both of these things involve him. These are the artworks that he owned. And then you see the links to the other people who own those artworks. But with the power of Wikidata, we can go further. We can know of those names that appear, what is their status? Who is a red flag name? And that becomes very interesting when you're trying to identify which artworks are potentially problematic and what the networks are when you see names that appear again and again. So in the second example, we'll start from the Holocaust victim, Max Silverberg, who was recently in the news because after many, many years, the Burl Foundation finally moved on a settlement that was painting by Manet called La Sultane, only in April of 2025, after many changes in provenance as well. And so what other artworks did Silverberg own? Where did they end up? Well, let's look at where they ended up. So if we run this query, this is what the query looks like. We're just going to run it live. And in this particular query, we've highlighted in fuchsia the names of the collections where those artworks ended up. So Max Silverberg, he was murdered in a camp, but the artworks ended up in these places. I don't know if you can see it up there. Kunsthaus Zurich, Art Institute of Chicago, Museum Wiesbaden, Musée d'Orsay, National Gallery of Art, all the best places. We can also view it a different way. For example, here, instead of focusing, it's the same data, but instead of focusing on where it ended up, we're focusing on what are the other names associated with the paintings. And here I've restricted the query to just show me paintings that were involved in claims for restitution. And so what we see here are names that appeared in the provenance of these. Wolfgang Bach and Nathan, Paul Rosenberg, Burl, a couple times, Frank Warnfeld, Gerlit, Schaefer, Yale, I don't know if that's there. Anyhow, so that's another way to look, because with the graph, if we're good with queries, there's lots of different ways we can get the information out depending on the question that we're asking. But that's not enough, because in Wikidata, we have a lot of paintings, but we don't have the other artworks. So how do we go from Wikidata out to another important source that has lots of information about looted art? Well, I mentioned all of these external identifiers. And in Wikidata, you happen to have lost art IDs given by the German Lost Art Foundation. And this ID is common between Lost Art Foundation and Wikidata. So if I go and I look at Max Silverberg in Wikidata, this is his record live in Wikidata. And I go down to my external identifiers. And I find his Lost Art ID, and click on it. This takes me to his record, which allows me to find all the objects that his heirs are searching for. And what you see there is 244 results, which is a lot more than what's in the data. And why? In part because Wikidata doesn't have all the information in the world. It has a lot, but not everything. But also because the Sum of All Paintings project concentrated on paintings, and it didn't do, for example, sculptures or decorative arts or many of the other kinds of objects that were stolen, or drawings. There's so many drawings. But what this does is it enables us to connect the two databases. And this is true for all the external identifiers. You have all the major museums have identifiers, object IDs, for example, and many of them have person IDs. RKD has a person ID. Many of them have person IDs, which will take you directly to that person in their own systems. So these connections via external identifiers are very powerful. Think of Wikidata as the information hub for Holocaust looted art. You can see just a few of them here, including, for example, the ERR project in France, RKD, DNB, Ulan, Jenny, Proviana, businesses, very important, including things like open corporates, and all kinds of artwork IDs, as well as very important sources and publications of certain kinds. So that's good, that's helpful. But when we talk about these long periods of time,
seems to be an automatic adios.
it's like doing stuff here. Well, okay. We're just going to jump in here. You probably all saw the news about this case in Argentina, where this horrific Nazi has kids. He's dead, but his kids are found to have artwork that was allegedly looted from the Jacques sticker. And this poses this problem of how we do this over time, the dynasties. Had the same problem with Berlet a few years ago. That entire family, Cornelius Wolfgang, Hildebrand, Helen, Benita, all of them were problematic. The Knudler dynasty is a very interesting one too, because there it's not only the dynastic blood relations, you're talking about entire business networks, and those business networks and their blood relations. Complex networks, but to understand their role in transiting looted art, you need to understand how they all relate to each other and be able to see all of those artworks and their intermediaries together. So dynasties are important because of Nazi war criminal dynasties, of course, because of red flag name dynasties like Berlin, and also because you have Jewish collectors before Hitler came to power who owned artworks, which are documented, which exposed in exhibitions, and that's documented. And then it wasn't, maybe they died, and their children inherited the artworks, and it's their children who are persecuted by the Nazis but you only have the documentation for the earlier owners. So you need to be able to make these connections across time in order to restitute the history. And then, the case that I'm going to go into a little bit here is a more difficult area to research, and I think one of the most fruitful, and that is art dealing dynasties which pop up in Holocaust-linked art cases. And to do that, I'm going to go back to my own case, which has a nice illustration. So in all of these dozen or so false provenances, and all the stories are different. That's the great thing about it. You'll see two names which have the same last name, Frank Pearls and Hugo Pearls, with false stories 30 years apart. The stories are different. I didn't put all of Hugo Pearl's stories here, so elaborate. So what does that mean? Two family members making up two different stories that are false about the same artwork? We really need to move this thing away.
The interesting thing is that people online don't seem to see it.
Oh, they don't see it. Oh, well, no,
Okay,
they don't see it.
all right.
All right. Great. So if they don't see it, that's fine. So if you look at Frank Pearls and Hugo Pearls, they belong to an art dealing dynasty. Hugo and Kate were married, divorced later, and they had two children, Klaus and Frank, who were both art dealers. And so the obvious question to ask is, well, was this the only case that they were involved in? You could probably guess the answer. No, there's at least 4 other cases that are documented. And one, Menzel v. List, is the first case where there was an actual lawsuit. Pearls sold a looted Chagall to List, and the family of Menzel, from whom it had been looted, sued List for the return of the painting, and List turned around and sued Klaus Pearls. And then you recognize the second case, which is ongoing case, the longest running case in history. So you wouldn't get that picture of a pattern if you just looked at one member of the family, but when you look at all of them together, you start to ask some questions. And then if you go out from your area of Nazi looted art and you say, well, what about other stuff? You'll see that not that long ago, there was a restitution from the Metropolitan Museum of Art for an artwork from Nigeria, which had been looted from the National Museum of Nigeria after 1960. And Klaus Pearls acquired it, gave it to the Met, and the Met had to give it back. So what you see is that these dealers, they don't think in terms of categories. I'm just going to deal with Nazi looted art. They're dealers. They deal with all kinds of things. And so one needs to open up to different kinds of artwork. In Wikidata, we don't have, what we have is paintings right now. We don't have the other kinds of objects in great numbers. If we did have those objects, I think we'd be able to see a lot more connections. So this is the kind of data visualization that becomes interesting when we're looking at dynasties. So what I did is I colored it in purple, remember the dynasty, just so that you can see them really quickly. Colored in red, people who are known to Wikidata to be our red flag names. And I colored in blue, people who are known to Wikidata to have been persecuted Jewish collectors. It doesn't get all of them. For example, it doesn't, there are Jewish, persecuted Jewish collectors in the ovals here who haven't been colored just because we did some kind of information to know that that's who they are. But that gives you a bird's eye view of what's happening. So one of the things that's interesting with Wikidata is that you have tools that have been laid on top of Wikidata, like NT-tree, which will immediately give you a dynasty, or metafacts, which allows you to explore very specific connections that interest you. And so if you take the Pearls dynasty and you do it for metafacts, the data underneath is wiki data. Metafax is your interface. What becomes interesting is that when you start going beyond simply what artworks did they own or who was in their family, you see other things, roles of authority, things they may have published. So for example, you will learn that Klaus Perls was the chairperson, he was the head of the Art Dealers Association of America. So this becomes interesting. Let's start looking at power roles and influences. And so if you start looking at patterns across dynasties, an interesting pattern to look at is presidents or vice presidents of art dealers associations in all countries who are members of art dealing dynasties, which have been linked to restitution claims. And there you're starting to talk about power networks and narrative networks. And that's the kind of thing you can do with Wikidata. So to do all of this, you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. There are tables of Wikidata queries, and Wikidata itself has published all kinds of queries that you can use. And I have published a public Google sheet, which has queries that I personally found useful, which anybody else can use or adapt to their own needs. Now, a last word about AI. Things are being revolutionized right now in astonishing ways. And one of the things that AI can do is it can write queries. So for example, you can go so far in writing a query, and then you can simply say to AI, please take this query and make it also do such and such. And AI will return a code for you, which you can then test and run. Another thing that AI can do is it can take, for example, output from Wikidata and run a query and say, give me all the red flag names and give me all the persecuted Jewish collectors and give me all the people linked somehow to restitution cases, label them as such, and you could take that file, and then you could take, for example, if you're a museum, your entire museum collections file, and ask AI to start matching the two. And then once you have that match, of course, you have the full power of Wikidata with all of the contextual information about who these people are and what their links are. And the last thing that you can do with AI, which is what I did here, is I used data from Wikidata. The base of this data visualization is data from Wikidata and no place else. And I asked AI to help me format in a way that was easy to understand. I don't have the skill to do this kind of data visualization myself. So if you look at this on the left, you see in red, you see owners of artworks who were murdered in the Holocaust. And here it's very limited. It's really just people who were murdered in the Holocaust. And in the middle, you see the artworks that they own. And on the right, you see the collections where they ended up. And that kind of powerful data visualization enables you to see patterns, which can be very interesting in researching Nazi related art. So here are just a couple QR codes for those interested in learning a little bit more. And thank you very much for your attention.